Okay, so the day of the 25th of December is known in traditional Jewish sources as Nittel. That is the name of the day. Nittel Nacht means the eve of Nittel. Nacht is night, as is, for those who want to practice their Yiddish, any English word with GH comes from German, and so the equivalent in Yiddish is going to have a ch. So night is Nacht, might is Macht, etc. Laugh is Lach, etc., etc. So Nittel is the Jewish term for the day in general, and Nittel Nacht is the eve of Nittel. What does the word Nittel mean? So it turns out that actually the word Nittel is related to the original name in Romance languages for this day, which is, in Italian it's Nadal or Natal or something like that. It's actually related to the English word natal, which means birth. So it's the day when the birth of Oisei Ha'ish is commemorated, and so it's called the day of Natal, Nadal, etc. And that became also the Jewish tradition, with the addition that, as is often the case, we've discussed this in the past, it was the Jewish tradition always, when they're referring to something of idolatrous nature, to sort of intentionally corrupt the word to make it have some sort of derogatory meaning. And so it has been suggested that the word nittel is connected to the word nitle, which in Hebrew means hung, and Oisei Ha'ish is often referred to in Jewish literature as the one who is hung. Others say that it's nittel with a tes, and it means it's taken away, etc. But basically, it's based on the original name of the day in the Romance languages. Till today, that's what it's called in Italy and probably in some others as well. That's the name of the word nittel. Jews referring to the day as nittel is a very ancient tradition, and it's already recorded in the days of Rashi in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, where it talks about not doing business with goyim on certain days which are associated with their Avodah Zarah. The Sefer Truma, the Baal Truma, Sefer Truma brings in the name of Rashi a number of days, and one of them is Nittel. So it's a very, very ancient name of the day. Now, in general, today we're here to discuss the specific minhagim and practices associated with Nittel. And much like we discussed this past Shabbos afternoon about the minhagim associated with the fifth night of Hanukkah, when it comes to minhagim, it's very common that you do not find any proper sort of sefer that is going to record the origins of the minhag, the reason for the minhag, the authority behind the minhag, or anything like that. It's just something which is going to go mipel oizen, from mouth to ear. It's a tradition. Everybody knows that we do this, right? I don't know. We probably have many things that we do like that today. I don't know. Everybody knows that we put kishka in the cholent and barley and beans, but not necessarily are you going to find that. If you open a book on Hilchos Shabbos, it's going to tell you of when you're allowed to add water to the cholent, when you take it off. It's not going to give you the recipe, right? So if you think of these type of minhagim as somewhat recipes, maybe you'll find them in a cookbook, not in a sefer. And specifically, when it comes to things, minhagim, or practices that are insulting to the host country's religion, people are going to be very, very careful not to write about it explicitly and not to write about it at all. And when they do have to write about it basically in code, and you find that a lot in Sfardim. And in fact, specifically when it comes to the minhagim related to Nittel and to Nittel Nacht, the earliest sources in print that we have are actually from the works of Mushumadim. These were Jews who became apostates, who were using their knowledge of growing up in the Jewish community to fight and undermine the Jewish community, and they were the ones who knew all the inside, all the skeletons in the closet and all the secrets. And the first records of minhagim of Nittel actually are found in those writings. As we discussed on Shabbos, many of these type of ancient minhagim are preserved primarily by Hasidim and Hasidic circles. I would say this is probably more true of other Hasidim other than Lubavitch, more what we call the Polish Hasidim, those who come from more, from Ukraine, Poland, etc. And that is true of many minhagim. And specifically with regards to Nittel, it is so true to the extent that if you just stop an average guy in the street who has never researched the topic, they will most likely tell you that Nittel is a Hasidic minhag. And it is true today, pretty much, that the only ones who observe the minhagim of Nittel are Hasidim. However, when we look into the origins of this, we'll see that actually the minhagim of Nittel long predate the Baal Shem Tov and predate Chassidus, and this was standard practice across Ashkenaz, and as we'll even see, hopefully we'll have some time to get to, some elements of it were even in Sfardic lands as well, in Turkey, Morocco, etc. So yeah, like I know as a kid, even growing up, often you would encounter, you're Chassidim, you're Bittul Torah, you don't learn, and as if this is another one of those minhagim which the Chassidim invented, which the Misnagdim are coming to say that you're violating Shulchan Aruch, etc. This is not the case at all. This is a very ancient, well-established minhag. There's a number of sources that are available to research this topic. One of the people who have written about this extensively is Professor Mark Shapiro, who's a professor in Scranton University. He's written about it both in academic paper and also in the journal Kovetz Or Yisrael from Monsey. He wrote an article about it there. In addition, there is a number of other works. Nittel Gavriel Zinner on his Hanukkah book published very nicely on this topic, including some very important sources. There's a whole sefer which is on the Eitzah Chachma called Hilchos Nittel Nacht, a genre of its own, not for now to get into that. And then finally, a very important resource which I'm going to share just a few points from at the end is from my friend Rabbi Shraga Hamnik, who last year did a very amazing work and deep dive into some of the minutiae sources of this topic and discovered some very interesting points. All right. What is the minhag? The minhag of Nittel, the minhagim, the primary two minhagim of Nittel Nacht are, number one, to refrain from Torah study until midnight. From the beginning of the night, there's discussion exactly when that starts, whatever, basically from the beginning of the night until midnight to refrain from Torah study. And secondly, to refrain from intimacy between husband and wife on this night. When it comes to that second minhag, there is a discussion as to whether or not that also only applies until midnight, or that implies the entire night, and Yetz Hashem, time permitting, we will get into what the Rebbe has to say about that, etc. One of the very earliest sources for this minhag in Sfardim is from Reb Yor Chaim Bachrach. Reb Yor Chaim Bachrach is usually known as the Chavis Yor, which is his most important or most well-known sefer. He is in Germany, and his dates are 1638 to 1702. So he is definitely 16th century, very prominent Pesach. Mark Shapiro in his article demonstrates that the minhag was widespread as early as the 16th century, and I think he's relying primarily on the sources from those Mushumadim, from the apostates, but already in Torah writings it appears in the 17th century. Rabbi Yoel Chaim Bachras writes about this in his sefer called, it's in his notes of Shulchan Aruch, it's called, hold on. Okay. It was printed only for the first time in 1982. So his main sefer, Chavis Yor, has been around for many, many years, but his sefer, his notes on the Shulchan Aruch, which the name of what they called it is slipping me right now, was only discovered and published by Machon Yerushalayim in 1982. So that's a relatively, in the scheme of things, recent source that came to light. As I mentioned, the Nittel Gavriel brings in many early sources for this. Not going to go through all of them. Many prominent Sfarim who you've all heard of. The Maharsha, for example, is recorded. The Maharsha didn't learn on Nittel Nacht. But one of the very important sources that the Nittel Gavriel brings is from the author of the Karban Hasanel. The Karban Hasanel is mainly known for his commentary in the Rosh, for those who have learned Gemara. And he writes like this. He says, Masha Amra Gisasi Bishmi, this that my sister-in-law said in my name. Emaso, this is true. Kilayla Zu, that this night, K'mo Yom Shecharav Beis HaMikdash, is like the day that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. Umitamza also Lilmid Bo K'mo Tisha B'Av, and therefore it is forbidden to learn on this day, like Tisha B'Av. So if you think about the two prohibitions, studying Torah and intimacy between husband and wife, those are two things which apply to mourning and on Tisha B'Av. So the association is quite obvious, and this is a suggestion that was made by many people. And he continues and he writes, "Times are also legalis. You're not allowed to tell anybody this reason. Again, for obvious reasons, this has to remain a secret just amongst us." Says the Korban Nesanel, because of this, the terrible minhag evolved that people play games on this night. Now, we'll touch a little bit later on more about the games, but what he's saying is, even people who are usually lamdim, people who are b'nei Torah, who study Torah, they don't realize that the whole purpose of not learning is because you're supposed to be in a mode of avelus, of mourning. So then obviously it would be out of in poor taste to be sitting and playing game tournaments on that night. Baruch Hashem, I thank Hashem that I had the insight to be able to discover what the true reason for this minhag is, and that it has to do with avelus, with mourning, and in other words, the day that they're celebrating, and the degree to which Yidden have suffered as a result of that religion over the years is a day of mourning for us. And so, Baruch Hashem, that I managed to discover the reason, and not because that's the reason, it goes without saying that it's not a night to be playing games. Now, one of the reasons why this is such an important source, besides being very early, what's the Korban Nesanel's dates? His dates are Tov Mem Zayin to Tov Kuf Chav Tes. So that's he's before the Baal Shem Tov. Yeah, he's born about 10 years before the Baal Shem Tov. And is because you see over here that he's not coming to tell you, do this minhag. He knows the minhag, he grew up with this minhag. He has no idea, nobody ever told him what the reason for the minhag is, and he is suggesting, this might be a good reason, this might be the right reason for the minhag. So again, you see how it was a very deeply entrenched minhag already by then. By the way, he's not here right now, but earlier this morning someone asked me, why do we do the secular date? Why not the date in the Jewish calendar? So just to touch upon that briefly, the Rebbe writes about this, but the gist of it is that it is specifically the day that they are celebrating that we want to, whatever the reasons, we'll see soon more reasons, but whatever the reasons for the minhagim of Nittel are, is not associated specifically with the day that he was born, but rather with the day that his birth is celebrated. And that's the day where we want to make sure that, if they're celebrating it, then the result is that we're mourning it based on this reason. And the other reasons also match up to that. This is even more significant nowadays when it's pretty much everybody knows. Nowadays it's common knowledge, I believe, that actually December 25th is not his birthday, or at least nobody knows when his birthday is, and it's just a 1 in 365 chance that it might be his birthday. And for whatever reason, the history is not for now, that became determined as the day to commemorate his birth, just for whatever reason. And so, it's not as if you were keeping the Hebrew date. We don't know when his Hebrew date is. We just do the date that the Goyim recognize, and of course, and this is also why in Russia and in those places where they follow the Orthodox, the Gregorian calendar, so they actually do it on January 7th, and there are till today some Hasidim who do January 6th, January 7th, because that would be on the old calendar, the date that was celebrated. I should mention, we've spoken about this at length in the past as well, that in Megillas Tanis it says that there's a fast on Tes Teves, and it says we don't know what the reason for the fast. They didn't tell us. They didn't tell us what the reason for the fast on Tes Teves is. We allude to this in the Slichus of Tanis of Asar B'Teves, that it talks about the 3 things that happened on Asar B'Teves, but it doesn't say what the 3 things are. So, in some versions it has 4 things. I think in the Tilas Hashem Siddur it says 3 and 4. But according to one suggestion, the reason for the fast on the 9th of Teves is associated with the approximate date that would have been December 25th and the birth of Isai HaIsh. So there is somewhat of a tradition to mark the birth of Isai HaIsh with the Hebrew date, but by and large the minhag is to do it on the day that the Goyim actually celebrate. All right. L'chayra, the next important source that we have to see is the Chassam Sofer. And again, this Chassam Sofer is very famous, and it was published. The Chassam Sofer, of course, is a very prominent Rav who begins his life in Ashkenaz and later on becomes the Rav in Prashburg, which is, today it's in Czech Republic, but it's what's it called today? Bratislava, yeah. But he's also associated with the Hungarian, the Oberland, the north part of Hungary. Anyway, so this tshuva was well known for a while, but it was actually missing some parts. And I'm sorry, I actually, before I get to Chasam Sofer, I want to mention one more very interesting thing. There is, Mark Shapiro published in Eretz Yisrael a letter from Rebbe Lozer Fleckels to the local bishop, or the local person in charge of the censorship. So usually most of the people, back in the days of the European censorship, there's really two types of censorship, or three types really, again, a topic for another class. But basically, we could divide it into two. There was the outside censorship, which meant that you had somebody from the government or whatever it was, or from the church, whose job was to make sure the Jews were not publishing anything inappropriate. And there were different ways that was done in different times, different places. And then there was also self-censorship, where the Jews initially, just l'chatchila, they avoided writing terms or matters that would get them in trouble. And that is actually quite common in the writings of the Chabad Rebbeim as well. The Tzemach Tzedek is known to have, he always talks about the Akum instead of the Goy and stuff like that in his halachic writings. Anyway, but so the Jews always had complicated relationships with the people in charge of the censor. However, one exception was Prague in these days. So we're talking here about Rebbe Lozer Fleckels. His dates are 1754 to 1826. And he is the prize student of the Noida Yehuda, who was the Rav of Prague. And so Mark Shapiro published a letter from him, a correspondence between him and the local person in charge of the censorship, who in that particular case was not a Meshumad. Usually the people in charge of the censorship, how do you get somebody who's going to be faithful to Christianity, but make sure to be able to discover and find anything that the Jews are writing that's not appropriate? So they got Meshamadim, they got people who had converted out apostates to help them. In this case, it was somebody who was born a Goy, who was very learned, and he actually he corresponded with Rebbe Lozer Fleckels in Hebrew. And it's interesting, you can see his Hebrew, it's obviously, there's some mistake, but it's always cute to see this Christian learned guy writing to the rabbi in Hebrew. And he basically writes a letter, and he had a very good relationship. He respected the Jews, and he had a very good relationship with the rabbi. And he says to the rabbi, is it true, he addresses the letter with wishing constant success to the great Rabbi Lozer Fleckels, the rabbi of all the Jews in the land of the Bahman, which is the Bohemian Empire, I guess it's called. Basically he asks him, is it true that the Jews don't learn Torah on this night, and that they play games and they eat and they do things? And is this custom rooted in the Torah and in the etc.? Anyway, he goes on and on with his questions, and despite their great relationship, Rebbe Lozer Fleckels bends himself over backwards to deny any such allegations, which obviously would not have been a good idea for him to acknowledge. And it's a fascinating letter, and he writes that, I'm surprised there's no source for this, not in the Talmud, not in the... And he starts off by saying that I don't really want to respond to you because in general my practice is that I don't correspond about things that are not explicit in the Talmud and the Rif and the Rambam and the Rosh. So this is just a made-up nonsense thing, which is, I don't know, maybe there's some low-life people who are not into Torah who do this funny stuff, but I'm even shocked that you would consider that this might be true, and he goes on in that vein. So this is another fascinating source. And he says, maybe some people do because it's on Hanukkah, so they're playing games. I don't know. And he does this whole, I don't recall. I think, why would this night be different than any other night that us Jews are commanded to study Torah day and night? And then he talks to him about one of the big minhagim of Nittel, which I don't believe I'm not aware of anybody who still does this, but one of the minhagim that's referred to a lot in the Sfardim was that the Jews would eat a lot of garlic on Nittel, and I think it was associated with, you wanted to have a bad smell and, that type of stuff. And he's like, I don't know, I've never seen anybody eat garlic on Nittel, So that's another very interesting source that Reb Mark, otherwise known as Reb Melech Shapiro, brought to the table. Anyway, back to the Chasam Sofer. So Chasam Sofer's tshuva was always very famous. However, it was lacking, and it was published only in full for the first time in Tafshin Nun Daled in 94. And over there, he says like this. Says whoever the person who he's corresponding with had suggested that the reason was to do with Avelus, just like we saw before. Many people have suggested that. And he says that I've never heard a good reason for this, so I don't know, but I don't think that the reason is for Avelus. And he says, I also know that there's a minhag that the mikveh remains locked on the night of Nittel. So this is another whole topic, which I don't plan to get into now, is the one minhag is to abstain, a husband and wife abstain on that night. But then the question is, what about a woman who has to go to mikveh that night? So do they abstain anyway? And so clearly in some places the minhag was that the mikveh is closed. So the Chasam Sofer does not like that minhag. He writes, "Ladati minhag shtusu v'yeshlim ches biyad hanoegim kein." It is a foolish minhag, and one should be moicha. One should object to those who have that minhag. And anyway, he says, and b'chlal, the whole reason of Avelus, if the reason would have been because of Avelus, because of mourning, why would there be a difference between before Chatzos, before midnight, and after midnight? That makes no difference. And then the Chasam Sofer goes on to say that I'll tell you what I think the reason is. I think the reason is because at midnight on this night, lahavdil, all the goyim get up to go and do their religious service. So it would not look good for all the Jews to be sleeping and all the goyim to be getting up and worshiping. So, but the problem is we can't say that we should also get up and worship at midnight, because then that would also look bad. Like we're going to say, oh, the goyim are doing it, so we're also doing it. And it says, for example, it's brought in Shulchan Aruch that even though there's a minhag, we've discussed this minhag in the past, it used to be quite a common minhag for everybody to fast on Erev Rosh Hashanah, but the minhag specifically was to get up early and eat something before the fast, so that you shouldn't look like something, whatever, I'm not sure exactly what the minhag was, but somehow to differentiate yourself from lahavdil, from the goyish practices. So he says we couldn't tell everybody you should get up at midnight to learn Torah because they're getting up. That doesn't look good. So what do? He says we're going to tell everybody you can't learn. If you're a Talmud Chacham and you can't learn, what are you going to do? Obviously, you're going to go to sleep and you're going to get up early to learn. So that way, we sort of engineered it such that everybody gets up to learn Torah at midnight without actually and it doesn't sort of, if you're looking at the world from a bird's eye view and you're saying, the goyim are getting up and the Yidden are honoratzim, we're also running to the Beis HaMedrash at midnight. So the Chasam Sofer suggests that would be the reason. He then continues to say that he says, based on this, he's not so happy, as we saw previously from the Carbon Asanal. He's also not so happy in general with people playing games. Now, again, a topic really for another class, but it's a fascinating discussion about the attitude of Yidden in the ancient days about playing games. Many of you may have heard, Yosef, I think we might have discussed this once, that the cards in the traditional 52 pack of cards, that each one of those cards represents a klippah, and you're not allowed to have those cards in your house, etc., etc. You never heard that, Yosef, growing up?
They use them as tarot cards.
So where's all this coming from? And if you look in the sources, you could find similar language about chess and other games as well. Where it's coming from is the whole gaming culture. Once upon a time, let's say it's kind of equivalent to saying going to Vegas. Like, a frum Jew doesn't belong in Vegas, right? You don't belong so a frum Jew doesn't belong playing games. So when the Rabbanim saw people playing games, it wasn't just, you're doing bittul Torah, you're not studying Torah. Playing games was very much a culture which was inappropriate for a Jew to be engaged in. So the Chasam Sofer continues to write over there that I think the reason for Avelus, I think he quotes it from his Rebbe, Rabbi Nosson Adler, and he rejects it. Okay, he adds over there that when he came, that originally he would make sure that nobody plays any games, and when he moved to Medinas Hagar, that's Hungary. So again, he lived in Pressburg, but in those days that was considered part of Hungary, if I'm getting the geography and history correct over here. So he says that also I made sure that nobody would play any games in general. In that part, in general, not specifically to do with Nittel. In general, people wouldn't play games. But I realized that because they weren't able to play games and they weren't also allowed to learn Torah on the night of Nittel, this caused problems, and there was machlokas and lashon hara, and basically you tied their hands. They're not allowed to learn Torah. They're not allowed to play games. What are they going to do? They're going to get up to no good. So he says, I realized and I realized that I shouldn't interfere with this, and if one night a year the Jews are playing games, is nish gefarlich. So that's how the Chassam Sofer finishes off his discussion of this topic. Now, however, Reb Mark Malach Shapiro, he, in his very scholarly article, I'm happy I have a printout here, anybody can look at it afterwards if you want. I'll read to you a paragraph of what he says over here. Okay, so another reason that has been suggested, and Mark Shapiro traces the earliest record of this suggestion, is that the minhag not to learn was because it was dangerous. Because it was dangerous to go out at night, because they were out there partying and they were drunk, and it was it was dangerous for Jews to be found outside, and so the Beis Medrash was closed, and so the minhag became not to learn. So Mark Shapiro writes like this: in fact, there is no need to give much regard to the explanation of Zweifel. I guess that's the person who originally suggested that idea. For one, there is absolutely no evidence to support his contention. Furthermore, there is no reason why Jews would have been in more danger on Christmas than on Easter. In addition, if this explanation were correct, one would have expected the rabbis to abolish public prayer on Nittel Nacht in order to ensure that people not venture out from their homes. Yet there is no evidence that that was ever the case. Elsewhere in the article he writes that, like, what do you mean? Everybody, B'nai Torah, like, you don't need to be in the Beis Medrash to learn. You could learn in your house. Like, the whole thing makes no sense, he says. And all of this leads me to doubt that rational considerations have anything to do with the origin of refraining from Torah study on the eve of Nittel. So he very strongly rejects both the reason, primarily this reason of danger. He also rejects the reason of avelos. And let me read to you a paragraph or two where he says what his maskana is, and from there I'll read to you something what the Rebbe writes. From the sources I have discussed, it is obvious that the practice of refraining from Torah study has an early origin dating back at least until the 16th century. The fact that it is not recorded in Hebrew literature of this time led to the notion that it is a late practice, perhaps instituted by the Chassidim. However, even before the recent publication of Rabbi Yochanan Bachar's commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, the evidence was clear as to its early existence. The difficulties this practice would have created had Christians become aware of it is obviously the reason why it was not recorded in print. It was, however, a popular oral tradition, and although the reasons behind it were forgotten in Germany, they remained alive and well in the more superstitious atmosphere of Eastern Europe. A clear illustration of this is seen in the fact that a 19th century writer records what he terms as a well-known reason for the practice, namely that Oisei Ha'ish not receive any benefit from the Torah study. It should not surprise us that this sort of explanation was advanced hundreds of years previously. What we are now confronted with is none other than a deeply ingrained oral tradition. Okay, now this is in fact, I don't remember exactly who he's quoting here, but he quotes the Rebbe's letter as well. This is the reason that the Rebbe writes in the letter, which I think is quite famous, that the reason not to learn on Nittel Nacht, is Shalei L'Hoisuf Chayus, not to provide any spiritual energy to Ish or Christianity, or I'm not sure exactly how the mystical things work, but that is the reason the Rebbe says. And whereas, as we discussed on Shabbos, often you have a minhag which developed, and then later there's other reasons slapped onto it. So whatever the reasons were to celebrate, for example, the fifth night of Hanukkah especially, and then later numerous reasons were given as sort of after the fact explanations for the minhag. Now, I always used to think of this reason that the Rebbe said, or something like that. I thought that, probably the reason was because of the danger, or because of Avelos, or whatever it is, and the Rebbe is just giving a more Hasidic or mystical spin, that it has to do with the mystical reason not to give more vitality to Klippas. But actually, it turns out that historically, that is most likely how the minhag originally developed way back in Europe. And again, those communities that were more attuned and aligned with mystical traditions and Chassidus, etc., are the ones who preserve this minhag more than the Lithuanian yeshiva community, etc., etc. Now, I want to share, before I get back to the question of whether or not, and the Rebbe's letter, about whether or not the prohibition on husband and wife being intimate applies after Chatzos, I want to share some highlights from what Rabbi Hamnik discovered last year. I listened to it last year. I listened to it again, preparing for this class. It's a fascinating class of his. It's like a 2-hour class on YouTube, very detailed. But I'm just going to share some highlights. Number one, so if you've ever encountered Sfardim, they get very uppity about this minhag. And just yesterday, somebody said, "Well, no, thank God we're Sfardim. We don't recognize the secular dates, right?" And Rebbe Vadi Yosef writes about this quite clearly, that the Sfardim never heard of the minhag of Nittel. And he brings in one of the articles I was reading here. He brings a quote which I did not have a chance to look up in the original, but he does bring a quote from Mordechai Eliyahu, who was also the Sephardi chief rabbi in Israel, that Sephardim don't have this custom. However, what Rabbi Hamnik proved very strongly, and he really got into the details of this, is that there are numerous Sephardi poskim who very strongly preserved and wrote about the minhag. They don't write about the minhag not to learn, but specifically about the minhag not to be intimate on this night. One of the perhaps most famous names who he brought from was Reb Chaim Palachi. Reb Chaim Palachi was, his dates are 1787 to 1868, and he is in Izmir in Turkey. He's quoting Reb Sadia Halevi, who is also in Turkey. Then there's also a Sefer Mara HaYolodim, which is Rabbi Rafael Ochana. His dates are 1850 to 1902. He's in Morocco. So all of these, again, Rabbi Hamdik gets into great details of tracing the chain, exactly who got it from who and how it made it from one place to the other. Fascinating stuff. But briefly, here you have a whole host of Sephardim who definitely, in fact, Rabbi Falachani, he actually brings it in the name, Reb Sadia Halevi, he brings it in the name of the Baal Shem Tov. So it's interesting how the quotes from the Baal Shem Tov made it to Sephardic lands. And again, most likely this quote from the Baal Shem Tov was known in Ashkenazic lands, but in the Ashkenazic lands they weren't free to write about it, so it didn't make it into any of the writings from that time, versus in the Muslim lands it was safe to write about this. But most definitely, at least in certain Sephardi circles, they did absolutely mark the date on the secular calendar, maybe not by abstaining from learning, but by abstaining from intimacy between husband and wife. Now, one of the, yeah.
Is there any indication that Sfardim from Spain, where it was Christian, versus Sfardim from Muslim?
Well, first of all, Rabbi Vadi Yosef is not, he's from Iraq. He never heard of it, right? Mordechai Eliyahu is a little bit more surprising that he never heard of it. But maybe he was I didn't look up the source. Maybe Mordechai Eliyahu was only talking about the prohibition of learning. But the primary Sephardic sources are definitely in Muslim lands, not in Christian lands, absolutely. It's interesting how in one of those Sfarim he talks about the day of the birth of their prophet, right? So obviously in Christian lands nobody would refer to him as the prophet, but if you're in a Muslim land you think of the Christian guy as the prophet. It's interesting. Okay. There is a sefer. Okay, so the Minchas Elazar writes. There's a letter from the Minchas Elazar to a Talmud about this, and the letter from the Minchas Elazar to the Talmud is about whether or not this prohibition applies after Chatzos. And it seems like the Talmud wanted to suggest that just like the prohibition against learning expires after Chatzos, so the prohibition against intimacy should also expire at the same time. However, the Minchas Elazar says no. And basically the argument of the Minchas Elazar is the Munkatcher Rebbe, who is a very prominent Pesach, the famous video which we've discussed, I think, about Yidden in America, Hitz Shabbos, that's from him. And he's also very puts a lot of significance to minutiae of minhag and nusach tefillah, etc. So he writes that the most important source about this to him is the sefer called Chupas Chasanim. We're not going to get into exactly that sefer right now, but in Chupas Chasanim there is a list of all dates on the calendar that a person al pi pnimis hanyonim, a person is supposed to abstain from intimacy with his wife, and so one of the dates is the eve of Nittel, and so then the Minchas Elazar says that I absolutely think that the prohibition applies after Chatzos. Why? Because if you're following the teachings of the Arizal, which the Chupas Chasanim clearly is, the Arizal teaches that a person should never be intimate with his wife in the first half of the night, only in the second half of the night. So if you say that every night of the year a person should only be intimate on the second half of the night, and then you're saying that these are the nights of the year that you should avoid, so obviously we're talking about after Chatzos. So based on that, the Minchas Elazar says that the prohibition of intimacy on the night of Nittel applies also after Chatzos. However, as Rabbi Hamnik very clearly proves in that talk from last year, that if you really go through all the sources to the Chupas Chasanim and all the sources and trace the journey that the sources took, it's clear that the Chupas Chasanim is actually compiling lists from different places and they have nothing to do with each other. So the prohibition or the minhag to abstain from intimacy on the night of Nittel has nothing to do with the Arizal. It doesn't come from the Arizal. It happens to be found in the book Chupas Chasanim on the same page where the prohibitions from the Arizal are found, which the prohibitions of the Arizal are more associated with Yom Tov. People may be familiar that it's a tradition to abstain on the nights on the Seder night and on the Simchas Torah, etc. So it happens to be on the same page in the Sefer Chupas Chasanim, but it's actually nothing to do with it. And so really the proof of the Minchas Elazar is not really a very good proof. And this all brings us to the letter from the Rebbe, which is published in Igros Kodesh, volume 12. It's printed in Shulchan Menachem and probably in a number of other places which collect these type of letters. So somebody asked the Rebbe what to do about this, whether or not the prohibition applies after Chatzos. And this person quoted to the Rebbe the words of the Munkatcher, and that he didn't say the proof. He just says that the Munkatcher writes in the Sefer Zecher Tzadik Levracha is brought a letter from the Munkatcher that it does apply after Chatzos. So the Rebbe says that I wasn't, presumably that means I never heard any instruction or directive specifically from the Frierdiker Rebbe about whether or not this applies after Chatzos according to our minhag. And you're quoting from me the Sefer from the Munkatcher. Well, I don't have access to that Sefer, so I don't know what he says there. And on the one hand, I would say that why should he be machar after Chatzos? We know in general the things of Nittel apply only before Chatzos, the prohibition to learn Torah, so why would that be different? And again, you and I know what the Munkatcher's proof was, but the Rebbe didn't see that. But then the Rebbe says, however, at the end of the day, when it comes to the mitzvah of Oina, it is very important to be in a holy state of mind. And if a person is going to be thinking that, tonight is Nittel, even he's going to think, now it's not Nittel, like once you're in the mode of thinking about Nittel or not Nittel, probably better abstain for the rest of the night as well. And it could be that later on, obviously, I don't remember if it says it in this letter or not, but the Rebbe wrote in many letters that obviously all of these chumras in this area are only if they're actually a chumrah, but if it's going to lead to a kula, if a person is not going to be able to be intimate with his wife, if that's going to cause him to engage in thoughts or behaviors which are not appropriate, then obviously don't do this chumrah. But that's the gist of the Rebbe's letter. So it's interesting that the Rebbe did not see the letter from the Munkatcher, and but as it turns out, that the proof of the letter that the Munkatcher writes in his letter, it doesn't seem to be such a good proof after all. And so we're kind of remaining with the directive of the Rebbe that perhaps strictly speaking it only applies before midnight, but if possible it would be appropriate to keep this chumrah for the entire night as well.
Speculatable that the Rebbe didn't see it, but instead of the Rebbe trying to dismiss it as, I don't have it. There's other things with the Minchas Elazar that the Rebbe also, microphone,
Okay, I don't know.
from the Rebbe in a respectful way.
Yeah.
No, I don't have that letter.
Oh, you're saying maybe they're, yeah, so I don't know. That could, I mean, yeah, I don't know. Maybe. I didn't think of that. That's
Say anything
possible.
about Leil Tefillah there?
No, I think that in Chabad, the accepted psak is that Leil Tefillah, you do go to mikveh. Maybe wait till after Chatzos, maybe not. I don't know. I'm not sure. But Al Kaponim, just to wrap it up, the summary is that this is a very ancient minhag which Chabad and other Hasidim still preserve, and the reasons for it, it seems from the very inception of the minhag, are mystical, and that it's difficult to trace the origins of it, and specifically from people who lived in Christian lands where we had to be very careful as to what we wrote and spoke about openly. But that is in fact the minhag. Yes.
2 questions. Firstly, in Chabad world, are the mikvahs closed?
To the best of my knowledge, in the United States of America, all the mikvahs are open on the eve of Nittel.
And is it established generally, do we know that whether Jews do or don't go to mikvah because of that? There's a mitzvah in and of itself to go to mikvah at the right time, right? So
well, it's interesting.
At the time you're supposed to go to mikvah.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because now you reminded me of something I forgot to say, and that is that one of in the traditional, in the halachic Gemara sense, the mitzvah to go to mikvah on time doesn't really apply nowadays. The mitzvah to go to mikvah on time is talking about in the days when Tumah and Tara applied and you weren't allowed to touch food or do things when you were impure, so it was a mitzvah to go right away. Nowadays, when it's not about touching food or anything like that, it's just about the permissibility of the husband and wife, the original Tefillah B'zman mitzvah that it says in the Gemara, according to most poskim, doesn't apply nowadays. But, however, you are 100% correct that we are generally, as a rule, generally speaking, we are careful not to push off mikveh night. And one of the primary sources for that is, in fact, the teachings of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, which again is about 1,000 years ago, Ashkenaz, mystically inclined teaching. And we've discussed in the past a number of times about Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid not marrying a niece, not marrying 2 brothers to 2 sisters, etc. Numerous things, not having the same sandik twice for 2 children. We've discussed various aspects of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. So the importance of going to mikveh in time is strongly influenced by the teachings of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. What's all that got to do with Nittel? Because in Rabbi Shraga Hamnik, again, literally combing through manuscripts on the National Library of Israel, not manuscripts, early prints, on the website of the National Library of Israel, Rabbi Hamnik managed to find a number of early prints of the Tzavos of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, going back to the earliest print that he found it was in 1580, which is the end of the 16th century, where in that print of Tzavos Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, it says that a woman is not allowed to lie her husband to be near her on the eve of Nittel. Now, whether or not that actually came from Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid or whether it was a later addition, the fact that it made it into such an ancient printing of Tzavos Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid certainly demonstrates that it was the same school of people who, whereas year-round, they were makbid not to push off a Leil Tefillah, they were also just as makbid that the night of Nittel was treated basically like Yom Kippur in this regard. Having said that, and like Rabbi Epstein I mentioned on Shabbos, when it comes to all these type of restrictions, in general nowadays, certainly the Rebbe had, if you could say, a bit of a, on the one hand, the conservative, we want to keep up the tradition. On the other hand, the Rebbe often wrote how chumras and being extra strict in these areas and nowadays leads to brings about the opposite effect, and therefore you have to be very careful. And I think that's probably why, at the end of the day, the mikvahs are all open on the night of Nittel this year. And if a specific individual believes, based on guidance with his rabbi, that it would be appropriate for him to push off the Leil Tefillah from Nittel to the next night, so then you don't have to keep the mikvah closed for that. That would be a personal decision for a person to make with his rabbi.
then the second point was the